Thanks for joining us. It's now 17 minutes past 12. What could possibly be wrong with being perfect? With getting the best grades? With being the top athlete or outperforming everyone at work? Perfectionists may seem to have it all together, but in fact, it may be the opposite. Our guest today is clinical psychologist Simon Sherry. He studies perfectionism and teaches in the departments of psychology and neuroscience and the Department of Psychiatry at Dalhousie University in Halifax. He's our guest today to help us understand perfectionism and why the pursuit of perfect can lead to mental health problems. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Good to have you here. I look forward to this discussion and learning why it's bad to be perfect sometimes. So to our listeners, we want you to join in. Are you a perfectionist or maybe a recovering perfectionist? Do you think it's a problem that should be addressed, or do you actually think it's something we should admire? Tell us about your experiences, maybe someone in your own family who you consider a perfectionist. And do you have you come to accept that being less than perfect is okay? Tell us how you got there. Our number is 1-800-565-1940. You can tweet me at CBC Maritime Noon or send an email. That's marnoon@cbc.ca. First, Simon, I guess we should define this. What is a perfectionist?
That's a great question. And the response is that perfectionism is multidimensional in nature. And there are several key dimensions that have been studied now for over 25 years. The first key dimension has a lot to do with what a layperson might think perfectionism is. This is someone who strives for perfection in nearly everything they do. They rigidly and ceaselessly try to be perfect. And oftentimes the motivation for this comes from within the self. These are people who are self-driven in their ceaseless pursuit of perfection. That's probably the form of perfectionism that's double-edged. It can be associated with both positive and negative outcomes. There's also clearly a darker and a more destructive dimension of perfectionism. This is variously called self-critical perfectionism or perfectionistic concerns. And this is a constellation of traits that involves an exaggerated and extreme concern over mistakes, a tendency to be quite self-doubting, to check and recheck to make sure that things are perfect. There's often intense self-criticism that accompanies this dimension of perfectionism. And these individuals often wrestle with intense perceived pressure that those around them need to be perfect.
So one of them sounds like a person who's just going to be a high achiever and happy and healthy. The other sounds like a person who's always going to be disappointed in themselves, even if they are very close to being the best.
Certainly, I agree with the second part of your statement. Someone high on this dimension of perfectionistic concerns or self-critical perfectionism is very vulnerable to dissatisfaction and to a wide range of negative health outcomes. With respect to that first dimension, you're correct that this is sometimes linked to higher achievement, but there is also a darker side to that aspect of perfectionism too. These individuals tend to be doing okay as long as everything's perfect. But of course, we all know that life is seldom perfect. So in the context of perceived or actual setbacks, these individuals can often become depressed, anxious, suicidal, and so forth. I think really you're talking along the lines of a widely available public myth that there are unambiguously good things about perfectionism. Minimally, I think perfectionism is a double-edged trait. It can be paired with both great achievement and great suffering.
Okay, but, is putting a negative label on someone who has high standards a way of minimizing what they've achieved or what they expect?
I have no problem whatsoever with high standards. In fact, I think people should actively strive towards being excellent, and I commend those who are disciplined and goal-focused and reliable and dutiful. This might be a trait we call conscientiousness, and for the most part, conscientiousness is linked to a wide range of positive outcomes. It's important, though, to distinguish perfectionism from conscientiousness. These individuals have a rigid and a compulsive need to be perfect. it's a personal requirement that they have, and they can be quite inflexible in the pursuit of perfectionism. And I think oftentimes when we have conversations about perfectionism and we're looking toward the good outcomes associated with perfectionism, we're often talking about conscientiousness as opposed to perfectionism.
All right. We're asking our listeners today if you are a perfectionist yourself. Do you consider yourself a perfectionist? Is it something you admire? Is it something you fear in people you know? Maybe you've found a way to be happy with being less than perfect. So Paul Campbell in New Brunswick is on the line. Paul, thanks for calling in. How are you doing?
I am living the dream, my friend.
Good stuff. Okay. So if you're living the dream, life is good. Does that mean you're not a perfectionist?
I am. I just finished a book last year called Good Night, Paul, The Journey to My NHL, Living the Dream. That's a book that I wrote. It chronicles my recovery from a tragic car accident where I was the designated driver. I did not make a mistake of drinking and driving. I was the designated driver. And I've learned that if you can't make mistakes, you won't learn anything, and you should relish your mistakes, because sometimes if you can't make mistakes, that's not being human. I was in a wheelchair for a while, and I would have loved to known the ability to run and fall down and fall off my bike, but I was in a wheelchair. So now I relish every mistake I make, and I don't make them on purpose, but I make a lot of them.
And why do you think that making mistakes and accepting that you make mistakes is a better way to live your life?
Perfect, because this morning I got up at 6 o'clock. I started mowing my lawn at 9. I decided not to wear my glasses and I use my bare feet and wear my shorts.
Okay.
That was stupid because I ran over a hornet's nest and I got stung 8 times.
Okay.
So I learned that. And then I ran in the house and a hornet went up my shorts and he stung me in the groin, not in the special region, but I learned that I will not do that again.
Okay. Well, I'm glad the hornet spared some parts. All right. Well, if you want to listen to what Paul has to say there, Simon, he's learning from mistakes.
I appreciate Paul's attitude. I think that it's vitally important not to see mistakes as catastrophes. And what we see in perfectionists is that they view nearly any sort of mistake as unacceptable. And I think if you're trying to be less perfectionistic yourself, or to try and maybe be a parent to a child who's very perfectionistic, it's important to work with that person to reframe mistakes, not to see them as disasters, rather to see them as learning opportunities. And whether it's pushing yourself to do something risky or exceptional, or mowing the lawn in bare feet over a hornet's nest, you do want to be trying on new experiences and not being anxiously fearful on the sidelines of life, concerned that you're going to make some sort of mistake.
Oh, how do we become a perfectionist, though? Is it because we're pushed too hard?
I think perfectionism sits on a bedrock of biology that's largely inherited. We know that perfectionism runs in families, and we have several studies that estimate somewhere between 30 and 50% of perfectionism can be explained with reference to genetics.
Well, that means parents aren't going to help you become less of a perfectionist then, in many cases.
30 to 50% still leaves a major contribution for the environment, and that certainly includes parental practices. We know that there are certain parenting behaviors that are very conducive to shaping a child in the direction of being a perfectionist.
For example?
Parents who are very controlling of their child. They may have a micromanaging approach where they want to strictly and harshly control what the child thinks, feels, and does. We know that parental psychological control, as it's often called in the research literature, can be very harmful to children and pushes them in the direction of being a maladaptive perfectionist. In addition to that, perfectionistic parents model perfectionistic behavior for their children, and perfectionistic parents often subject their children to an awful lot of criticism and lofty and unrealistic perfectionistic demands, which, not surprisingly, our research shows is a setup for the development of perfectionism.
Lots in there for parents to think about. All right, Charlotte Gauguin is in Moncton. Charlotte, how are you?
Hi, I'm great. How are you?
Good. Do you consider yourself a perfectionist?
Yes, I have struggled with perfectionism for a while now. I'm a university student. I go to Dow, and I've really discovered that perfectionism kind of can destroy you almost. I've struggled with anxiety, and I've had bouts of depression, and perfectionism is all about pushing yourself so hard to attain these goals, but it's like even when you attain them, it's never enough.
So is there an example you could tell us about your year at university, for example, where you felt you were being too much of a perfectionist and that it was pushing you to be anxious and depressed?
So let's take, for example, the honor roll. So you need a certain GPA to reach that. And basically that was my goal, and I was studying almost every day for hours, and I really wanted to reach that goal. And finally, in the end, when I got the letter saying I made the honor roll, it I almost brushed it off. Like, okay, I did this, and now I have to do the next thing.
Now, you realize this about yourself, so are you trying to change it?
Yeah, so I wanted to really take this opportunity to tell others, even students or not students, you can always get help, like therapy and talking to your doctor. Like, it makes a world of a difference. And although I still struggle with perfectionism, there's ways to really regulate it, and it makes a huge difference. Well,
and I know, Simon, I want to just bring you in on that discussion. In the university environment, you must see quite a lot of situations like Charlotte's.
I think that what Charlotte describes is in many ways classical for a perfectionist, and I appreciate the openness she's shown here today in discussing those issues. In particular, what stood out for me is that oftentimes when a perfectionist achieves perfection or something darn close to it, there is a process whereby they go back and determine that their goal was too low or their outcome was unfavorable, and they should or must be doing more. I think oftentimes for perfectionists too, when they climb a particular mountain and reach a particular pinnacle, they often realize that achievement in and of itself is kind of hollow, and there's a disappointment or a letdown. At that point, though, perfectionists often rededicate themselves to another and higher goal.
So it just gets tougher and tougher. Charlotte, are you heading into second year then at Dell this year?
Yeah. Yes, I am.
What's your plan for this year? Are you going to let yourself off the hook a little bit, or what do you think?
Yeah. At first, I thought, okay, once I reach 3.7 or 3.8, I'll go for 4. But after, I've been kind of trying to be easier on myself. So this year I really want to focus on being happier, because the truth is, even though you're reaching these goals, you're miserable. You're pushing yourself and you're not very happy. Even though you think you want to attain something, it's like you said, it's almost hollow. So I'm trying to be really easy on myself this year.
Well, good luck, and I appreciate you calling us and telling us your story.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Charlotte. We're talking today about perfectionism. Are you a perfectionist? Maybe you know someone who is. Perhaps you're a recovering perfectionist. Our number is 1-800-565-1940. Give us a call. Our email here is marnoon@cbc.ca. We'll be back with more on perfectionism in a moment. First, the latest news. Ryan Pierce is in. Hi, Ryan.
Hi, Normally. Someone's been passing some imperfect money around in the Campbellton area. Fake bills. Police say the counterfeit $20 and $100 bills have pink Chinese lettering on one side, and that's how you can spot whether you've got one in your wallet. The federal government says there's a chance a right whale that was spotted tangled up in ropes earlier this week off the Gaspé Peninsula may have freed itself and joined a pod of whales nearby. And a third person has been charged in the killing of Nadia Gonzalez in Dartmouth in June. 60-year-old Wayne Andrew Burke is accused of first-degree murder, along with a young man and a young woman who were charged the day after Gonzalez died. Updates on those stories at 1 o'clock, Normally.
All right. Thanks, Ryan. Once again, call us us at 1-800-565-1940 and join our discussion about perfectionism. Are you over being perfect? My guest is clinical psychologist Simon Sherry. He studies perfectionism. So if perfectionism can be a problem, what should we be striving for? Mediocrity? What do you think?
I think we should be striving to be excellent. I think that the goal-setting aspect of perfectionism is probably the least harmful aspect of it. I think what gets perfectionists into trouble is not shooting for the stars. It's the intense criticism that can arise from not reaching those goals. If you set a really lofty goal and strive toward it in a disciplined way, I think that's great. But if you fall short of that goal and you beat yourself up to the point you're intensely self-critical and maybe prone to depression or anxiety, that's most unhelpful. The other thing I'd want to disentangle here too is that going for perfection doesn't mean you're going to get a perfect outcome. In fact, perfectionism is often self-defeating in that you can be relentlessly striving towards lofty goals but derailed from those goals. For example, in an academic setting, perfectionism is associated with procrastination, fear of failure, fear of success, public speaking anxiety, statistics anxiety, and a host of other difficulties.
You're so afraid to fail that you just can't get yourself going.
Perfectionism can certainly be paralytic. It's linked with a wide range of avoidance behaviors. Sometimes the crushing pressure to be perfect is so much, people just freeze.
All right, John Solos is in Yarmouth County. John, hi. Thanks for calling in.
Hi.
Are you a perfectionist?
I think I have tendencies that way, but I've learned better over the years. I'm still a workaholic. I don't think that's likely to change until my system boots me out of that sort of tendency.
Good.
But there's a difference there, though. I mean, I heard the student talk, and I think one of the other things I'd like to chime in and say is that there's an optimal level of effort. You don't want to be too relaxed when you're tackling things. You also don't want to beat yourself up too much. And everybody has their own optimum there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you've learned to be easier on yourself.
Yeah, another thing I wanted to say, and this is something I've learned through my work in life especially, and we had this tendency in university too, there's a big difference between being the best and doing your best. If you're fixated on being the best, you run into ethical challenges. Sometimes doing your best means helping other people do their best.
All right, well, John...
That generates the most benefits.
All right, John, thank you. Simon, would you want to hire a perfectionist? I'm guessing the answer is no.
Question. It's a loaded question in that I work at Dalhousie University and perfectionism is rife in academic settings. So I'm surrounded by many high-achieving individuals, some of whom are no doubt perfectionistic. But if I had to make a recommendation to employers, no, I think perfectionists would make for difficult employees.
How?
They tend to have more of a hyper-competitive orientation. They tend to have a more combative relationship to other people and to not function so effectively on teams. That would be one concern I would have. We also know that perfectionism leaves many people highly vulnerable to stress, anxiety, depression, and other factors that can very well complicate the successful completion of projects.
All right, so having the best marks or the top of the class might be a flag then for some employers if it's a perfectionist who's been trying for that.
There's often a really awkward transition for perfectionists. It's not an accident that we've been talking about perfectionism in an academic setting today. Perfectionists like to use scales. It could be a weight scale, it could be a grade point average scale, and they use those scales in inappropriate ways. They use those scales as an index of their worth or value as a human. And in academic settings where you have a structured environment that tells you, okay, you have 3 exams occurring over a 4-month period, it's kind of a convenient metric for perfectionists to measure how they're doing. But when you get out into the so-called real world where there aren't tests or frequent points of feedback, where there isn't this convenient yardstick to measure yourself anymore, things get complicated. In fact, having spent many, many hours talking to perfectionists in research and in clinical settings, very few of them know what perfection is, even in terms of their own personal definition. So they're often striving towards something that's very vague and very confusing, and that confusion becomes heightened when you move out into the real world. What is it to be the perfect radio host or clinical psychologist?
Good question. Okay. Reem Roston's in Halifax. Reem, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. Thanks for calling in. Do you consider yourself a perfectionist?
Not as bad as I used to be. So I think you mentioned recovering perfectionist.
Yes.
I would say I'm getting closer to that point. One of the things I graduated from dentistry at Dal, and one of the things that they once told us when they do the interview is that they look for students with some obsessive compulsive traits, and one of them happens to be the perfectionism trait.
So your phone's cutting out a bit, but they said they look for obsessive compulsive traits, and one of them is perfectionism?
Perfectionism, exactly. So in the interview process, and my husband he's finishing up his residency in psychiatry, and he'll tell you that professionals tend to have obsessive compulsive traits. And one of the things that helped me actually was I had my second daughter a week before I started second year of dental school, and I had to reassess my priorities. So I couldn't achieve those grades that I wanted to achieve because I had a newborn at home where I was also the primary caregiver. And that, I think, along with the fact that I'm married to who I'm married to, helped me reassess priorities. So in my work, sometimes I'll come across a patient where I don't feel like I've given my 100%, and that can sometimes come home with me and keep me up at night. And just realizing that and working on that and realizing what the worst case scenario could be, I mean, and that I'm not there or something like that actually helps me a lot. So I've calmed down a lot more in my work life. I've calmed down a lot more in terms of, I will never achieve perfectionism. But what strikes me as odd is my daughter, who's actually 7 now, she uses words like perfect, and I try not to use that language with her at home. We tell her that there's no such thing as perfect. You be the best who you can be. There will always be someone better than you, because I think that even though I've never used the language perfect with her, there must be some sort of traits that are inherited, because I can see a lot of myself in her.
Well, that's what Simon was saying earlier, that you said 30 to 40% could be sort of a biological component here. So, are you happier, Reem, because you've let go a little bit?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, God, yes. I think it's a detrimental. That actually it borders on, having some of it is okay in the workplace, but having too much of it is not. It can be detrimental. So.
Right. Okay. Well, that's interesting, Simon. Any advice for Reem with a 7-year-old daughter who's showing signs of being a perfectionist like her mom was?
Well, one thing I picked up on from this caller, and I won't comment specifically on her, but as a general point, it's good to diversify when you are a perfectionist, or if you're trying to help parent someone who may be leaning in that perfectionistic direction. Perfectionists often have an unduly narrow focus on one or two particular areas. It may be the workplace, it may be appearance, it may be trying to be perfect for other people. And over time, I think what a lot of perfectionists need to do is diversify, not to put all their eggs in, for example, the achievement basket, to spend more time socializing, more time parenting, more time in recreational settings, more time in athletic settings, or what have you. Perfectionists will have disproportionately their esteem in one or two areas, and that leaves them highly vulnerable. All of a sudden, if you don't get a good mark on a test and the majority of your self-worth is based on academic performance, that can have catastrophic consequences.
As what would the extreme be?
I think the extreme would be death by suicide. Our research group recently completed a comprehensive review of more than 50 years of empirical research on perfectionism and suicide. And we were able to show that there's a robust link between perfectionism and suicide. Of note, perfectionism is even related to suicide after you take into account hopelessness and depression. In other words, it's hard to explain away the link between perfectionism and suicide. And I think it's important information to share with the public and with health professionals, because oftentimes perfectionists create a facade that everything's perfect, and beneath that facade can be tremendous pain and tremendous distress.
All right. Well, Reem, thank you for calling in. We're going to go to Cheryl in Cheryl Lamerson, who's in Lunenburg today. Cheryl, thank you. How are you today?
I am just fine.
Great. Are you a perfectionist?
I think I'm a reformed perfectionist.
Okay. Tell me about what your experience has been.
Well, I can remember my father saying if I got 98% on an exam, he'd say, "What did you do? Spell your name wrong?" So the message was always very much perfect, perfect, perfect. Not be the best you can be, but be the absolute best. And that's a lot of pressure. And I got to a point in my late 20s, early 30s that I was very insecure about it. I was very stressed by it. And I finally just got to a point where I said, no, I can't do this. This isn't right. And from then on, I realized that if you're always trying to be perfect, you're doomed to feel like failure. Because 99.9% is not good enough. Only 100% is good enough, and human beings aren't made for that. So I have really tried to resist by saying, I'm going to do good enough, I'm going to do very well, I'm going to do the best that I can, but I don't do perfect.
How, after you've finished school and you're no longer being sort of graded on a daily basis, how did you find that you kind of continued that in your life outside, the academic world?
Oh, well, I spent 40 years in the military, so I was graded every day. Performance appraisals, annual reports, all have a grading system, which is good as a comparison to you could do better in a certain area, but it is very challenging for a perfectionist. So I really just had to concentrate on doing the best I could and trying to improve, but not trying to be perfect.
Oh, look, well, thank you for the call, Cheryl.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Do perfectionists, when they, as you said, it's the exams are the perfect way to measure for a perfectionist, but after that's over, do perfectionists tend to seek out other things where they can be measured, where it can be, it's obvious what success is?
Some perfectionists will stay on a path striving toward high achievement, and these may be some absolute superstars in the workplace. It's important to realize, though, that at many points of transition in life, like the transition from high school to university or the transition from university to the workforce, we lose a lot of perfectionists along the way. That could be through death by suicide, but more often we're going to lose perfectionists who become overwhelmed by mental health challenges, in effect, disabled by their mental health challenges. This could be through periods of crippling depression or anxiety, for example. So yes, some people do make that transition along the way and continue to be stars out of university and into the workforce, but a lot of people will struggle greatly, and oftentimes perfectionists will get so paralyzed they just quit. They retain the concern over mistakes. They continue to feel great pressure to be perfect. They're often intensely self-critical, but the striving, active component where they're going to go out and work relentlessly to be perfect stops. And oftentimes it's that person who's suffering the most because they're intensely self-critical while doing very little.
All right, let's take another call. Bonnie Thibodeau is in Halifax. Bonnie, hi. Thanks for the call.
Hi, thank you for taking my call.
Where do you consider yourself a perfectionist?
Yes, completely.
And are you okay with that? Are you trying to be less perfect?
It's interesting that I'm hearing the words recovering perfectionist more often, because I've been trying to call myself a recovering perfectionist for about 20 years, but I keep relapsing. And I'm curious to see if the kind of comparison between recovering perfectionist and recovering alcoholic is a good one, where I tend to self-soothe with my relapses of perfectionism instead of, like, I can accommodate external grading, performance reviews and such. I can let go, but the internal grading system, my inner comparison to everything else and my inner grades, that's what I'm relapsing on. I'm curious, is it okay to think of it as a recovering alcoholic would, where I'm going to try to self-soothe and I need to take care of that?
All right, Simon, what do you think?
It's a great question. I think it's a good idea to view perfectionism as a personality trait. And by that I mean it's a characteristic that's highly stable across the life course. By the time you're 30, you're quite likely to be the person you're going to be for the rest of your life. And we know that perfectionism tends to be highly stable across the life course, in particular from early adulthood through to the elderly years. That's not to say, though, that perfectionism is cast in stone. I think it is possible in some meaningful, in some substantive ways to recover from perfectionism. Some of your callers may have done that through adopting what sounds to be a more compassionate relationship with the self. Some individuals may need the assistance of another person, like a psychologist or a psychiatrist, to assist them in making those changes. But it does seem that perfectionism is fairly persistent across the life course.
So you say by the time you're 30, if you haven't adjusted, that it's going to be a tougher time, or less likely that you will. Yeah.
I would say that is the case, that personality is fairly stable. Now, there is some emerging evidence that perfectionism is treatable. There are interventions like interpersonal therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy that have shown some promising early evidence that it may be able, through something like treatment, to change perfectionism. We don't really have a pill for perfectionism at this point, so there's no compelling evidence on the pharmacological side of things. But it does look like medium to longer term interventions may have some positive effects in terms of altering perfectionistic behavior. I think that another important way you can try and change your perfectionism is to address the almost inevitable mental health challenges that come along with it. So, for example, if you were socially anxious or wrestling with depression, oftentimes when that social anxiety or depression is treated, the perfectionism itself tends to lessen.
Okay. All right, Amy Birch is in the Truro area today. Amy, hello to you.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. You've been listening in to our conversation on perfectionism. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I have a bit of a different perspective. So, I mean, first of all, kudos. A lot of the people who've called in are talking about sort of being in remission or being able to sort of fight through it, or, that hasn't been my experience at all. So I'm 27, so I'm almost 30. I was just listening to some of what you guys were just talking about, and that's sort of how I'm feeling more. So I guess the best way that I would explain it in my words would be, so right now I'm driving, I'm on my way to Edmonton, so I'm in Truro, and it's an overcast, cloudy day, and I'm looking outside, and I'm looking at the grass and the trees, and everything is sort of muted, like the colors are sort of faded. And in my brain, I have to tell my brain that even though it's not as green as it could be, it's okay. Does that make sense? Like, in my brain, the perfect version of my day today, the sun would be shining and all the green colors would be really vibrant. But it's not vibrant. I'm talking to you about it, so it's conscious, but subconsciously in my head, I have to kind of tell my brain that even though it's not the perfect day, it's okay, and it doesn't affect me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're working on it, kind of thing. It's understanding and
I think it's just more of an awareness about how the world isn't perfect. I'm not seeing the world as it could be today. But that said, if it was really sunny and it was really green, it would be perfect and it would be satisfying to me. Like, I would I would be like, oh my God, this is such a gorgeous day, and I would be happy.
Yes. Simon, you wanted to get in on that?
To me, what our caller highlights is an idea you might call discrepancy. There's often for perfectionists a discrepancy between the way the world is and the way a perfectionistic person thinks the world should be. And that discrepancy can be quite distressing. And in the context of that discrepancy, perfectionists are often prone to depression or anxiety or feeling very, very stressed and overwhelmed. And perfectionists are often trying to close that discrepancy, sometimes by actively striving to close that gap between the way the world is and the way they think it should be. But that gap seems to be irreducible for a lot of perfectionists. It's hard to close that gap, and the wider that gap gets, the more distressed that person can become. There's another aspect of perfectionism that we haven't talked about yet today too, and that is the tendency of some perfectionists to direct their need for perfection outward toward other people. Some people require that those around them be perfect, and they can do that in a pretty haughty and grandiose way, expecting that other people should be perfect for them. This is a more narcissistic flavor of perfectionism. I don't think we've had any sense of that from our callers today, but I can assure you out there that there are people suffering from their forced proximity to these narcissistic perfectionists. This could be in the form of a boss or a spouse or someone else you chronically come into contact with on a day-to-day basis, and these individuals are enormously difficult to relate to.
Look, there's been so much to think about here, and as we head back into another season of school, back to university, back to school, back to work for many, I guess it's something to keep in mind. Watch yourself. You don't have to be perfect. And
absolutely.
And there's help.
And I appreciate the opportunity to come here and speak today. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. Simon Sherry was our guest today. He's a clinical psychologist. He studies perfectionism. He teaches in the departments of psychology and neuroscience and psychiatry at Dalhousie University in Halifax. And I want to thank all the callers who called in to share their own experiences with perfectionism. Great to hear from you. If you have anything more to say about the pursuit of perfection, we'd like to hear it. Tell us your story. You can leave a message for us at 1-800-565-5463, and our email address is marnoon@cbc.ca.